A 9-year-old princess collapses to her knees in the grand hallway of Windsor Castle, clutching her stomach and crying out in agony. The royal guard standing just feet away freezes, his training abandoning him in this moment of crisis. Her small voice echoes through the marble corridor. My stomach is destroying me. What happens next will shock the entire royal family and reveal a truth that changes everything. This is the true story of Princess Charlotte's terrifying ordeal and the guard, who couldn't move. The morning of March 15th started like any other day at Windsor Castle. The sun rose over the ancient stone walls, casting long shadows across the perfectly maintained gardens. Inside the castle, staff members moved quietly through the corridors, preparing for another day of royal duties and obligations. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But within a few short hours, the calm would shatter into chaos. Princess Charlotte woke up that morning feeling slightly off. She was only 9 years old, but already she had learned to carry herself with the grace and composure expected of a royal. Her room was filled with soft morning light, and outside her window, birds sang their cheerful songs. She sat up in bed and immediately felt a small twist in her stomach. It was nothing serious, she thought, just a little discomfort. Perhaps she had eaten too much dessert the night before. Her nanny Maria came in to help her get ready for the day. Charlotte was scheduled to attend a private tutoring session in the morning, followed by lunch with her grandmother. It was a light schedule, nothing too demanding. Maria noticed that the young princess seemed quieter than usual, but Charlotte insisted she was fine. She dressed in her school clothes, a simple navy blue dress with a white collar, and tied her hair back with a ribbon. The tutoring session took place in the castle's library, a massive room filled with thousands of books, some dating back centuries. Her tutor, Mrs. Henderson, was a kind woman in her 50s who had been teaching royal children for over 20 years. Charlotte tried her best to focus on the mathematics problems in front of her, but the discomfort in her stomach was growing. It started as a dull ache, barely noticeable, but with each passing minute, it intensified. Mrs. Henderson was explaining fractions when she noticed Charlotte's face had gone pale. The young princess was pressing one hand against her stomach, her other hand gripping the edge of the desk. "Your Royal Highness, are you feeling well?" Mrs. Henderson asked, concern filling her voice. Charlotte looked up, trying to smile, trying to be brave. "I'm fine," she whispered, but her voice trembled. "Just a little stomach ache." The tutor wasn't convinced. She had seen children try to hide their discomfort before, especially royal children who were trained from birth to maintain composure. But there was something different about Charlotte's expression. Her eyes showed real pain, the kind that couldn't be easily dismissed. "Perhaps we should call for your nanny," Mrs. Henderson suggested gently. Charlotte shook her head. She didn't want to make a fuss. She didn't want anyone to worry. They continued the lesson for another 15 minutes, but it became impossible for Charlotte to concentrate. The pain was spreading now, radiating from her stomach throughout her entire abdomen. It felt like something was twisting inside her, squeezing and pulling. She tried to breathe through it, tried to remember her training about maintaining dignity under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't about keeping calm during a public appearance or remembering proper etiquette. This was real physical pain, and it was getting worse. Finally, Charlotte raised her hand slightly. "Mrs. Henderson," she said softly, "I think I need to stop." The tutor immediately closed the textbook and came around the desk. She could see the princess was sweating now, despite the cool temperature in the library. "Of course, dear. Let's get you back to your rooms." She helped Charlotte stand, but the moment the young princess got to her feet, she gasped and doubled over slightly. The walk back to Charlotte's chambers should have taken less than 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. They moved slowly through the castle's corridors, Mrs. Henderson keeping one supportive hand on Charlotte's shoulder. The princess tried to walk normally, tried not to show weakness, but each step sent a jolt of pain through her body. "Staff members!" They passed in the hallway, noticed something was wrong. But royal protocol prevented them from asking questions. They simply nodded respectfully and continued on their way. Guard Robert Williams was stationed in the East Corridor that morning. He was 32 years old, had served in the military for 10 years before joining the Royal Guard, and had been protecting the royal family for the past 3 years. He took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously. He had been trained to maintain his position no matter what, to never break protocol, to never show emotion or react to anything happening around him. He was a statue, a silent protector, invisible yet always present. When he saw Princess Charlotte and Mrs. Henderson approaching, he stood even straighter. Protocol required him to acknowledge royalty with a subtle nod, which he did, but then he noticed something was wrong. The princess was walking strangely, hunched forward, one hand pressed firmly against her stomach. Her face was extremely pale, and her breath came in short gasps. For a brief moment, Robert's training wavered. He wanted to ask if she needed help, wanted to call for assistance, but he remained frozen in place. Charlotte and Mrs. Henderson passed him, moving toward the royal family's private quarters. Robert watched them go, conflict raging inside him. Should he break protocol? Should he alert someone? Before he could decide, they had turned the corner and disappeared from view. He returned to his rigid stance, staring straight ahead, but his mind was racing with worry. In her chambers, Charlotte's condition continued to deteriorate. Maria, the nanny, took one look at the princess and immediately became alarmed. She helped Charlotte onto her bed and called for the castle's medical staff. Within minutes, Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived. Dr. Mitchell was the royal family's primary physician, a skilled doctor who had treated everyone from minor colds to serious injuries. She examined Charlotte carefully, asking questions about when the pain started, where exactly it hurt, and what it felt like. Charlotte tried to answer, but the pain was making it difficult to think clearly. "It started this morning," she managed to say between shallow breaths. "Just a little ache at first, but now it feels like something is tearing inside me." Dr. Mitchell's expression grew serious. She pressed gently on different areas of Charlotte's abdomen, watching the girl's reactions. When she pressed on the lower right side, Charlotte cried out. The doctor immediately suspected appendicitis, a serious condition that required urgent medical attention, but she needed to be certain before making any decisions. She took Charlotte's temperature and found it was elevated. She checked her pulse and found it racing. All the signs pointed to appendicitis, possibly even a ruptured appendix, which could be life-threatening if not treated immediately. Dr. Mitchell stepped out of the room to make an urgent phone call. She contacted the palace's medical coordinator and explained the situation. They needed to get Princess Charlotte to a hospital right away, but this wasn't a simple matter. Moving a member of the royal family required careful planning, security arrangements, and coordination with multiple departments. However, given the severity of Charlotte's condition, they would need to move quickly. Back in the room, Charlotte's pain had reached unbearable levels. She was crying now, something she rarely did, something she had been trained not to do in front of others. But this pain was beyond her ability to control. Maria held her hand, whispering soothing words, trying to keep the young princess calm. "It's going to be okay," Maria said softly. "The doctor is getting help. You're going to be fine." But Charlotte didn't feel fine. She felt like her body was betraying her, like something terrible was happening inside, and she was powerless to stop it. The pain came in waves now, each one stronger than the last. During the worst moments, she couldn't think, couldn't speak, could only focus on trying to breathe through the agony. She had never felt anything like this before in her young life. Dr. Mitchell returned and explained that they were arranging emergency transport to the hospital. An ambulance was being prepared, security was being notified, and her parents were being contacted immediately. Charlotte's mother and father were at an event in London, but they were being informed and would meet her at the hospital. The doctor gave Charlotte some medication to help with the pain, but warned that it would take a few minutes to work. Those few minutes felt like hours. Charlotte lay on her bed, curled into a ball, tears streaming down her face. She could hear the activity happening around her, people moving quickly, urgent voices, phones ringing. But it all seemed distant, like it was happening to someone else. All she could focus on was the fire burning in her stomach, the relentless pain that wouldn't stop. Outside in the corridors, staff members were quickly preparing for the emergency evacuation. Word had spread throughout the castle that Princess Charlotte was seriously ill and needed immediate medical attention. Security teams were mapping out the fastest route to move her from her chambers to the castle's entrance, where the ambulance would be waiting. Every second counted now. Guard Robert Williams received the alert on his radio. All guards were being notified to clear certain corridors and prepare for the royal evacuation. He listened to the message with growing dread. Princess Charlotte, the same girl who had walked past him just an hour ago in obvious pain, was now in a medical emergency. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Should he have done something when he saw her? Should he have broken protocol and called for help? The castle, usually a place of calm routine and ancient tradition, had transformed into a hub of controlled chaos. But despite all the preparation and planning happening around her, Princess Charlotte lay in her bed, knowing none of it, feeling only the terrible pain that seemed to have no end. The worst, however, was yet to come. The medication Dr. Mitchell had given Charlotte was supposed to ease the pain, but it seemed to have little effect. If anything, the pain was intensifying, reaching levels that the young princess couldn't comprehend. She had scraped her knees before, had bumped her head, had experienced the normal pains of childhood, but nothing had prepared her for this. This was a different kind of pain, deep and relentless, like her body was at war with itself. Maria stayed by her side, holding a cool cloth to Charlotte's forehead, whispering words of comfort that seemed inadequate against the scale of the girl's suffering. Dr. Mitchell checked her watch repeatedly, calculating how long it would take for the ambulance to arrive, for the security team to prepare, for everything to be ready. In a normal situation, an ambulance would simply arrive and the patient would be loaded and transported. But this wasn't a normal situation. This was a member of the royal family, and every movement, every action required careful coordination. Charlotte's breathing had become shallow and rapid. She was trying to be brave, trying not to cry out too. Loudly, but small whimpers escaped her lips with each wave of pain. Her hands clutched at the bedsheets, knuckles white from the force of her grip. Dr. Mitchell monitored her vital signs carefully, growing more concerned with each passing minute. The princess's condition was deteriorating, and they needed to move her soon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was actually only 12 minutes, Dr. Mitchell received confirmation that everything was ready. The ambulance had arrived at the castle's private entrance. Security teams had cleared and secured the route from Charlotte's chambers to the exit. Medical staff were standing by with a stretcher. It was time to move. The doctor leaned close to Charlotte. "Your Royal Highness, we need to move you now. We're going to take you to the hospital where we can help you feel better. Can you be brave?" For just a little longer, Charlotte, her face wet with tears, nodded weakly. She would try. She would try to be brave like she'd been taught, even though every fiber of her being wanted to scream. 2 medical staff members entered with a wheelchair. Dr. Mitchell had decided against the stretcher for now, thinking that wheelchair would be faster and easier to maneuver through the castle's corridors. They helped Charlotte into the chair as gently as possible, but even the slightest movement caused her to cry out. Once seated, she immediately curled forward, arms wrapped around her stomach, trying to compress the pain away. They began moving through the castle, Dr. Mitchell leading the way, Maria walking alongside Charlotte, and 2 security guards following behind. The route had been carefully planned to use the widest corridors and avoid stairs wherever possible. Other staff members had been instructed to stay out of sight, giving the medical team clear passage. The castle, usually filled with the quiet bustle of daily activities, was eerily silent now. As they moved through the east corridor, Charlotte's pain suddenly spiked to an unbearable level. She let out a cry that echoed off the ancient stone walls, a sound of pure agony that seemed wrong in this place of tradition and dignity. The wheelchair stopped as everyone turned to her in alarm. Charlotte was gasping now, unable to catch her breath, her whole body trembling. This was the moment when Guard Robert Williams heard her cry. He was still stationed in the east corridor, maintaining his position as protocol demanded. When the sound of Charlotte's anguish reached his ears, something inside him shattered. He could hear the medical team trying to soothe her, could hear Dr. Mitchell's urgent voice giving instructions, but he remained frozen in place. His training told him to stay where he was, to not interfere, to maintain his post. But his humanity screamed at him to do something, anything. Charlotte tried to speak through her tears and pain. "Please," she gasped, "make it stop. My stomach is destroying me." Her words were desperate, the plea of a child who couldn't understand why this was happening to her. Dr. Mitchell knelt beside the wheelchair, checking Charlotte's pulse again, feeling how rapid and irregular it had become. This was worse than appendicitis, she realized with growing alarm. Something had possibly ruptured or was about to. The doctor made a quick decision. They couldn't wait. They needed to move faster, even if it meant causing Charlotte more discomfort in the short term. "We need to run," she said to the team. They began pushing the wheelchair more quickly, trying to balance speed with smoothness. Charlotte's cries grew louder as the movement jostled her, each bump in turn sending fresh waves of agony through her small body. Robert watched them pass, watched the princess in her wheelchair, her face contorted in pain, tears streaming down her cheeks. He saw Maria running alongside, saw Dr. Mitchell's grave expression, saw the urgency in everyone's movements. And he stood there, unable to move, unable to help. Frozen by years of training that demanded he maintain his position above all else. Even as they disappeared around the corner, even as Charlotte's cries faded into the distance, he remained standing at attention. But inside, Robert was breaking. He had joined the Royal Guard because he believed in service, in protection, in being there when people needed him most. Yet when a 9-year-old princess had passed him in agony, when she had cried out in pain just feet away from where he stood, he had done nothing.
Ow.
Protocol had demanded his stillness, but his conscience demanded action. The conflict tore at him. The medical team reached the castle's private entrance where the ambulance waited, its lights already flashing silently. The back doors were open, the interior prepared with all necessary emergency equipment. Paramedics stood ready to receive their royal patient. They worked quickly to transfer Charlotte from the wheelchair to the ambulance stretcher, trying to be as gentle as possible, but knowing that speed was critical now. Charlotte was barely conscious at this point, the pain and stress overwhelming her young system. Dr. Mitchell climbed into the ambulance with her, continuing to monitor her vital signs. Maria tried to follow, but security informed her that only medical personnel could accompany the princess in the ambulance. The nanny stood at the entrance, tears in her eyes, watching as the doors closed and the ambulance began to pull away. Inside the ambulance, Dr. Mitchell worked quickly. She started an IV line to give Charlotte fluids and stronger pain medication. She placed an oxygen mask over the girl's face to help her breathe more easily. The paramedics drove as smoothly as possible while still maintaining emergency speed, knowing that every bump in the road caused their young patient more suffering. The journey to the hospital would take approximately 15 minutes. But Charlotte's condition was critical enough that every second mattered. Meanwhile, back at Windsor Castle, news of the princess's emergency evacuation was spreading. Staff members whispered to each other in concerned tones. Security guards communicated through their radios, coordinating the aftermath and ensuring everything was properly documented. Castle administrators began making phone calls, updating various officials, and preparing statements. Of royal protocol moved into action, dealing with the crisis according to centuries-old traditions and modern procedures. Robert Williams remained at his post in the East Corridor, but he was no longer really there. His body stood in position, his eyes stared straight ahead, but his mind was replaying the scene over and over. He heard Charlotte's cry echoing in his memory, saw her small face twisted in pain. Remembered the desperation in her voice when she had said those words, "My stomach is destroying me." Other guards began rotating through, taking their turns at various positions throughout the castle. When Robert's replacement arrived, he mechanically went through the formal transfer of duty, then walked to the guards' quarters in a daze. Several of his colleagues tried to talk to him, asking if he had heard about Princess Charlotte's emergency, but he barely responded. He sat on his bunk, still in uniform, staring at the wall. At the hospital, Charlotte was rushed into the emergency room. A team of specialists was already assembled, having been alerted by Dr. Mitchell during the ambulance ride. They performed a rapid examination and immediately ordered an emergency CT scan. The princess, now heavily sedated, was wheeled into the imaging room while doctors reviewed her symptoms and test results. The scan revealed what Dr. Mitchell had suspected. Charlotte's appendix had indeed ruptured, and infection was spreading into her abdominal cavity. This was a serious, potentially life-threatening condition called peritonitis. She needed emergency surgery immediately. The surgical team was notified and began preparing the operating room while Charlotte was prepped for the procedure. Charlotte's parents arrived at the hospital in a state of controlled panic. They had been at a charity event in London when they received the urgent call about their daughter's condition. The drive to the hospital had been the longest 40 minutes of their lives. Now, standing in the hospital corridor, being briefed by doctors about ruptured appendices and emergency surgery, they struggled to maintain the composure expected of royals while internally falling apart with worry. They were allowed to see Charlotte briefly before surgery. She was conscious but heavily medicated, her eyes glazed and unfocused. When she saw her mother and father, fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "It hurt so much," she whispered. Her mother took her hand, kissed her forehead, and told her how brave she was being. Her father stood beside the bed, his jaw clenched tight, fighting to keep his emotions in check. Then the surgical team arrived, and Charlotte was wheeled toward the operating room. Her parents could only watch as their daughter disappeared through the double doors. Knowing she was facing a serious procedure, and there was nothing they could do but wait. They were directed to a private waiting room where they could remain during the surgery, away from any public areas where they might be photographed or disturbed. Back at Windsor Castle, the atmosphere was somber. Word had spread about the ruptured appendix and emergency surgery. Staff members went about their duties quietly, many sending up silent prayers for the young princess. The castle felt emptier somehow, as if Charlotte's absence had created a void that couldn't be filled. Robert Williams sat alone in his quarters, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except those few moments in the corridor. He replayed every second in his mind. The moment he saw Charlotte walking past with Mrs. Henderson, clearly in pain, the moment he heard her cry out as she passed in the wheelchair, the words she had spoken that now haunted him, "My stomach is destroying me." He thought about all his training, all the hours spent learning protocol and procedure. He had been taught that a royal guard's duty was to maintain position, to provide security through presence, to never interfere or react. But what good was that training if it meant standing frozen while a child suffered? What kind of protection was he providing if he couldn't even call for help when someone was in distress? The more he thought about it, the more Robert realized that something fundamental had broken inside him that day. He had followed his training perfectly, had done exactly what was expected of him, according to protocol. Yet he felt like he had failed in every way that truly mattered. He had prioritized rules over compassion, procedure over humanity, and the guilt was crushing him. The surgery lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. For Charlotte's parents, each minute felt like an hour. They sat in the private waiting room, largely in silence, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. Medical staff checked on them periodically. But there was little new information to share while the surgery was still in progress. All they could do was wait and hope that their daughter would pull through. The surgical team worked with precise efficiency. They had performed appendectomies countless times before, but operating on a member of the royal family added an extra layer of pressure. Not that it changed their medical approach, but the attention and scrutiny that would follow made everyone acutely aware that everything needed to be perfect. The lead surgeon, Dr. James Patterson, was one of the country's most experienced pediatric surgeons, and his steady hands had saved many young lives over his 30-year career. The ruptured appendix had indeed caused peritonitis, and the infection had spread further than they initially hoped. The surgical team had to carefully clean out the infected material, ensure all contaminated tissue was removed, and thoroughly irrigate the abdominal cavity. Charlotte's young body had been fighting the infection for hours. The stress it had caused was evident in her inflamed tissues and elevated white blood cell count. After what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Patterson finally emerged from the operating room and approached Charlotte's parents. His surgical mask was pulled down, and though his expression was serious, there was relief in his eyes. "The surgery went well," he told them. "We successfully removed the ruptured appendix and cleaned out the infection. Princess Charlotte is stable now and being moved to recovery." The wave of relief that washed over Charlotte's parents was visible. Her mother closed her eyes briefly, breathing deeply. While her father's shoulders sagged as the tension finally released, Dr. Patterson continued with the details. Charlotte would need to stay in the hospital for several days on intravenous antibiotics to fight any remaining infection. She would be in some pain and discomfort as she recovered, but with proper care and monitoring, she should make a full recovery. They were allowed to see her once she was settled in the recovery room. Charlotte lay in the hospital bed looking incredibly small and vulnerable. Monitors beeped softly, tracking her heart rate and oxygen levels. An IV line ran into her arm, delivering medication and fluids. Her skin was pale, and her breathing was slow and steady from the anesthesia. But she was alive, and she was going to be okay. Charlotte's mother sat beside the bed, holding her daughter's hand, while her father stood behind her, one hand on his wife's shoulder. They stayed like that for a long time, just watching Charlotte breathe, grateful for each rise and fall of her chest. The hospital staff gave them privacy, understanding that these were parents who had just been through one of the worst experiences imaginable and needed time alone with their child. Back at Windsor Castle, Robert Williams had spent the afternoon in a state of internal crisis. He had gone through the motions of his duties mechanically, but his heart wasn't in it. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Charlotte's face contorted in pain. Every time he heard a sound in the corridor, he remembered her desperate cry. The guilt was eating him alive. That evening, as his shift ended, Robert made a decision. He couldn't continue like this. He needed to talk to someone, to confess what he was feeling, to somehow make sense of what had happened. He requested a meeting with Commander Harrison, the head of the Royal Guard. Such requests were unusual, but not unheard of, and the commander agreed to see him the following morning. That night, Robert barely slept. He lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events over and over. He thought about his training, about all the times he had been told that a guard's duty was to maintain position regardless of circumstances. He thought about military discipline, about following orders, about the importance of protocol. But he also thought about a 9-year-old girl crying in pain and how he had done nothing to help. The hospital, meanwhile, was on high alert. Security had been increased around Charlotte's floor to ensure privacy and protection. Media outlets had already gotten wind of the princess's emergency hospitalization. Reporters were gathering outside the hospital, looking for any information they could get. The royal family's press office was preparing a carefully worded statement about Charlotte's condition, balancing the public's right to know with the family's need for privacy during this difficult time. Charlotte woke up several hours after surgery, confused and disoriented. The anesthesia had left her groggy, and it took several moments for her to remember where she was and what had happened. The pain was still there, but it was different now, duller and more manageable. The destroying, tearing sensation in her stomach was gone, replaced by a general soreness from the surgical incisions. Her mother was still beside her, and when Charlotte opened her eyes, her mother smiled with relief and squeezed her hand gently. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "You're okay now. The surgery is over and you're going to be just fine." Charlotte tried to speak, but her throat was dry and scratchy from the breathing tube that had been used during surgery. A nurse helped her take small sips of water, and gradually, Charlotte's awareness returned. She had questions, as any child would. Why had her stomach hurt so badly? What had the doctors done? How long would she have to stay in the hospital? Her parents answered each question patiently, explaining in simple terms about the appendix and why it had needed to be removed. Charlotte listened, still processing everything, trying to understand how something inside her own body could cause such terrible pain. Over the next few days, Charlotte slowly began to recover. The antibiotics worked to fight the infection, and her young body's natural healing abilities kicked in. She remained in considerable discomfort, and the surgical incisions were tender. But the pain was nothing compared to what she had experienced before surgery. She could manage this pain. She could breathe through it. It didn't consume her the way the appendicitis had. Her siblings came to visit, bringing drawings and cards they had made. Friends sent messages and gifts. Her grandmother visited daily, sitting beside her bed and reading her favorite stories. The hospital room filled with flowers and stuffed animals, though Charlotte was too tired to appreciate most of it. She slept a lot during those first few days, her body using all its energy to heal. The media coverage was intense, but respectful. The public had been informed that Princess Charlotte had undergone emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix and was recovering well. Well wishes poured in from around the country, and indeed from around the world. People sent cards and messages, all hoping for the young princess's speedy recovery. The story dominated news cycles for several days, the medical experts being interviewed about appendicitis in children and the importance of recognizing the symptoms early. At Windsor Castle, Commander Harrison met with Robert Williams in his office. The commander was a stern man in his late 50s, a career military officer who had served with distinction before taking command of the Royal Guard. He had seen many things in his time, dealt with countless situations. But the expression on Robert's face as he entered the office told him this was something different. Robert stood at attention as protocol demanded, but his usual confidence was absent. He looked exhausted, haunted even. Commander Harrison gestured for him to sit, an unusual informality that Robert appreciated. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Robert began to talk, slowly at first, then in a rush, as everything he had been holding inside came pouring out. He described seeing Princess Charlotte walk past him that morning, clearly in distress. He talked about how he had remained at his post, following his training, doing exactly what he had been taught to do. He explained, hearing her cry out later. When the medical team was rushing her to the ambulance, and how he had stood frozen, unable to move, unable to help. His voice cracked as he repeated Charlotte's words, "My stomach is destroying me." Robert admitted that he hadn't slept properly since the incident, that every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, that he kept questioning whether he had done the right thing. Protocol said yes, he had followed every rule correctly, but his conscience said no, he had failed when it mattered most. He looked at Commander Harrison with red-rimmed eyes and asked the question that had been tormenting him. What good is our training if it makes us freeze when someone needs help? Commander Harrison listened to everything Robert said without interruption. When Robert finally fell silent, Commander leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. What he said next would not be what Robert expected to hear. The commander began by acknowledging that Robert had indeed followed protocol perfectly. His actions, or rather his lack of action, had been exactly what his training prescribed. But then Commander Harrison said something that surprised Robert. He admitted that perhaps the protocol itself was flawed. Perhaps there needed to be room in their training for human judgment, for compassion, for responding to emergency situations, even if it meant stepping away from their posts. The commander revealed that he had been thinking about this very issue for some time, particularly as the royal family had become more modern and accessible, and situations were arising that centuries-old protocols hadn't anticipated. The commander shared his own story from years earlier, when he had been a young guard and had faced a similar dilemma. A member of the royal staff had collapsed in a corridor, and he had broken protocol to call for help and provide first aid. He had expected to be disciplined for abandoning his post, but instead, his commanding officer at the time had commended his quick thinking. "We protect people," Commander Harrison said firmly. "That's our primary duty. Everything else, all the protocols and procedures, they exist to serve that purpose. When they prevent us from protecting people, then something is wrong." Robert felt something shift inside him as he listened. The guilt was still there, heavy and real, but it was no longer crushing. Commander Harrison wasn't excusing what happened or dismissing Robert's concerns. Instead, he was validating them, acknowledging that the situation had revealed a genuine problem with how the Royal Guard approached their duties. The commander promised that he would bring this issue to higher authorities, that he would push for changes in training and protocol that would allow guards to respond appropriately to medical emergencies. More immediately, Commander Harrison suggested that Robert might want to speak with Princess Charlotte once she was recovered enough for visitors. Not to apologize, the commander emphasized, because Robert had done nothing wrong according to his training, but perhaps to simply see her, to witness her recovery, to remind himself that she was okay. Sometimes, the commander said, the only way to move past guilt was to face it directly. Charlotte spent 6 days in the hospital. By the 5th day, she was walking short distances with assistance, eating light meals, and feeling significantly better. Her natural energy and spirit were returning, though she still tired easily and needed frequent rest. The medical team was pleased with her progress, and plans were being made for her discharge and return home to Windsor Castle. During those days, Charlotte had plenty of time to think about what had happened to her. She remembered the pain, though the memory was already becoming less sharp, less immediate. She remembered being in the wheelchair, being rushed through the castle corridors, hearing the urgency in everyone's voices. But what struck her most was how everyone had helped her. Her tutor had recognized something was wrong. Dr. Mitchell had acted quickly. The medical team had moved fast. Even now, the nurses and doctors caring for her showed such kindness and attention. One afternoon, as Charlotte was sitting up in bed working on a puzzle her brother had brought her, there was a knock on her hospital room door. Her mother looked up from where she was reading, and a nurse poked her head in. "Your Royal Highness," the nurse said to Charlotte's mother. "There is someone here who would like to visit Princess Charlotte if you approve. It's one of the guards from Windsor Castle, a Mr. Robert Williams." Charlotte's mother was surprised by the request. It was unusual for a guard to ask to visit. She could see from the nurse's expression that there was something important about this request. She agreed, and a few moments later, Robert Williams entered the room. He was not in uniform but dressed in casual civilian clothes, looking nervous and uncertain. He had rehearsed what he might say a dozen times during the drive to the hospital. But now, standing in the room with Princess Charlotte, sitting up in bed looking at him with curious eyes, all his prepared words vanished. Charlotte recognized him immediately. She had seen him many times in the castle corridors, always standing so still and straight, always in his formal uniform. Seeing him now in regular clothes made him look different, more like a normal person. "Hello," she said in her quiet, polite voice. "Have we met before?" Robert cleared his throat, suddenly feeling very young despite his 32 years. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. I'm one of the guards at Windsor Castle. I was on duty the day you became ill." He paused, unsure how to continue. Charlotte's mother watched the interaction carefully, sensing there was more to this visit than a simple well-wish from a staff member. Charlotte thought for a moment, trying to remember. So much of that day was a blur of pain and fear. Then something clicked in her memory. "You were in the corridor," she said slowly. "When Mrs. Henderson was walking me back to my room, I remember seeing you there." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You looked worried." Those words hit Robert harder than he expected. She had noticed. Even through her pain, she had seen his concern. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I was worried. I saw that you were in pain, and I wanted to help, but I didn't know what to do. I stayed at my post because that's what I was trained to do. But afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about whether I should have done something differently." Charlotte's mother started to speak, perhaps to reassure him that he had done nothing wrong, but Charlotte spoke first. "Were you the guard who was there when they took me in the wheelchair too?" she asked. "I remember hearing someone breathing, someone nearby, when I cried out." Robert nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, that was me. I heard you say—" He stopped, struggling with the words. "You said your stomach was destroying you, and I just stood there. I wanted to help, but I didn't move. I didn't do anything." The room was quiet for a moment. Charlotte looked at Robert with her 9-year-old wisdom, processing what he had said. Her mother watched, ready to intervene if needed, but somehow sensing that this conversation needed to happen. Finally, Charlotte spoke, her voice gentle. "But you weren't supposed to move, were you? That's your job, to stand guard and protect us by staying at your post." "Yes," Robert said. "That's what I was taught. But when I saw you in pain, when I heard you crying, staying at my post felt wrong. It felt like I was failing to protect you by not doing anything." Charlotte considered this. She had grown up surrounded by protocols and rules. She's been taught from a young age about the importance of duty and proper behavior. But she had also been taught about kindness and compassion. "I don't think you failed," she said thoughtfully. "There were doctors and nurses there to help me. That was their job. Your job was to keep the castle safe. Everyone was doing what they were supposed to do." But Robert shook his head gently. "With respect, Your Royal Highness, I don't think that's quite right. Yes, there were medical people to help you, and they did their jobs wonderfully. But if I had seen you collapse, if there had been no one else around, my training would have told me to maintain my post and call for help on my radio, rather than going to you directly. And I think that's wrong. I think if someone is hurt or in danger, we should be able to help them, even if it means stepping away from our posts." Charlotte's mother had been listening carefully, and now she spoke up. "Mr. Williams, I appreciate you coming here and sharing your concerns. I can see this has affected you deeply." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I want you to know that my husband and I have already been in communication with Commander Harrison about this very issue. What happened with Charlotte has made us all think about protocols and procedures, and whether they serve their intended purpose in every situation." Wow. Robert looked surprised. He hadn't realized that the conversation had already reached the highest levels. Charlotte's mother continued. "The truth is, Mr. Williams, the royal family depends on people like you. People who take their duties seriously and want to do the right thing. The fact that you've been struggling with this, that you felt compelled to come here today, tells me that you're exactly the kind of person we want protecting our family." Charlotte, who had been listening to the adult conversation, suddenly reached out and took Robert's hand. The gesture was unexpected, informal in a way that broke numerous rules of royal protocol. But it was also perfectly natural for a child wanting to comfort someone who was sad. "Thank you for worrying about me," she said simply. "I'm okay now, see? The doctors fixed my stomach, and soon I'll be able to go home." Robert looked down at the small hand holding his and felt something in his chest finally release. The guilt that had been crushing him for days didn't disappear completely, but it transformed into something more manageable, something he could live with. "I'm so glad you're okay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's all I wanted, for you to be okay." They talked for a few more minutes, Charlotte telling him about the surgery and the matter-of-fact way children have of discussing serious things, showing him the get-well cards her siblings had made, even laughing a little as she described how strange it felt to wake up from anesthesia. Robert found himself relaxing, seeing not the princess he guarded, but simply a brave little girl who had been through something scary and come out the other side. When he finally left, promising to see her back at the castle once she was home, Robert felt different than when he had arrived. He had come seeking forgiveness for something he still wasn't sure required forgiving, and he had found something unexpected, understanding, and a reminder of why he had chosen this job in the first place. To protect people. To serve. Not just to stand in corridors following rules, but to genuinely care about the safety and well-being of those in his charge. The following week, Charlotte returned to Windsor Castle. She was welcomed home with cheers from the staff, who had been so worried about her. Her siblings had made a banner that hung in the entrance hall. Even the usually stoic butlers smiled when they saw her. She was still recovering, still needed to rest frequently and avoid strenuous activity. But she was home, and that was what mattered. Robert was on duty the day she returned. He stood at his post in the East Corridor, the same place he had been standing when she passed by in pain over a week earlier. This time, when Charlotte came down the corridor with her family, she was walking normally, smiling, looking healthy and happy. When she saw Robert, her face lit up with recognition, and she gave him a small wave. He maintained his formal stance, but allowed himself a genuine smile in return. A small break in protocol that no one would question. Commander Harrison made good on his promise. In the weeks that followed, new training protocols were introduced for the Royal Guard. While maintaining position and security remained paramount, guards were now explicitly authorized to respond to medical emergencies, fire alarms, and other immediate dangers to life and safety. They were trained in basic first aid and emergency response procedures. The protocols were updated to reflect a more nuanced understanding of protection, one that didn't require turning into statues when real help was needed. Robert Williams continued his service with the Royal Guard, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He understood now that true protection meant more than following rules blindly. It meant being present, being aware, being ready to act when action was needed. And yes, sometimes it meant making judgment calls that protocols couldn't fully address. The experience had changed him, made him both more confident in his abilities and more humble about the limitations of training and procedure. For Charlotte, the incident became a story she would tell throughout her life. The time her appendix ruptured, the terrible pain, the emergency surgery, the days in the hospital. But what she remembered most wasn't the pain, which faded with time, as pain always does. What she remembered was how many people had cared for her, had worked to help her, had worried about her. The doctors and nurses, her family, her staff, and yes, even the guard who had been so troubled by his inability to help that he came to visit her in the hospital. The incident also marked a change in how Charlotte thought about the people who worked at the castle. Before, they had been somewhat invisible to her, part of the background of her daily life. But now she saw them differently. She understood that behind every uniform, every formal position, there was a real person with thoughts and feelings and concerns. She made more of an effort to greet them, to thank them, to acknowledge their presence and their service. Months later, at a private ceremony in Windsor Castle, several people who had been involved in Charlotte's emergency care were recognized for their service. Dr. Mitchell received a commendation for her quick diagnosis and decisive action. The paramedics who had transported Charlotte were thanked personally by her parents. The hospital staff who had cared for her received letters of gratitude, and Robert Williams, to his surprise, was also called forward. Charlotte's father spoke briefly about how the incident had prompted important changes to Royal Guard protocols, changes that would better serve the family and the guards themselves. He acknowledged Robert specifically for having the courage to question whether the existing protocols were sufficient, and for caring deeply enough about Charlotte's well-being to carry that concern forward. It wasn't a reward, exactly, but a recognition that sometimes the most important service comes from asking difficult questions and pushing for necessary changes. Charlotte was there at the ceremony, fully recovered now, looking healthy and happy. When Robert was called forward, she insisted on being the one to shake his hand and thank him personally. As they stood together, the 9-year-old princess and the 32-year-old guard, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended their different roles and positions. They had both been through something that day, had both been changed by it, and they had both come out the other side better for the experience. In the years that followed, Charlotte would occasionally see Robert on duty in the castle corridors. Sometimes she would nod politely and continue on her way. Sometimes she would stop and exchange a few words, asking how he was doing, telling him about her studies or activities. It was a small thing, but it meant something to both of them. A reminder of a day that had been terrible and frightening, but it ultimately led to growth and understanding. Robert would later tell other guards, especially the new recruits, about that day. Not as a story about what he had done wrong, but as a story about how important it was to think beyond protocol, to remember the human element of their work. We're not just guarding buildings or positions, he would say. We're protecting people, real people with real lives. Never forget that. The story of Princess Charlotte's emergency and the guard who was frozen by protocol became, in its own way, a turning point for how the royal household thought about service and protection. It sparked conversations about the balance between tradition and practicality, between following rules and using judgment, between maintaining formal distance and exercising compassionate care. These weren't easy questions, and they didn't have simple answers. But they were important questions, worth asking and worth grappling with. And for Charlotte, the experience shaped her understanding of leadership and responsibility. She learned that even royal families needed other people, depended on their expertise and care and dedication. She learned that showing vulnerability wasn't weakness, but simply part of being human. And she learned that sometimes the most important thing someone can do is admit when something isn't working and have the courage to change it. The physical scar from her surgery would fade over time, becoming barely visible. But the lessons from that day, the memories of pain and fear and recovery, the understanding of how many people had worked together to help her, these would stay with Charlotte throughout her life, shaping the kind of person she would become and the kind of leader she would eventually be.